The following is a conversation with Yara Peterko from Austria. Yara is a practicing occupational therapist, a board member for Ergotherapie Austria, and a delegate representing Austria in the World Federation of Occupational Therapy. Let's welcome Yara and hear about occupational therapy in this alpine country, Austria. Occupational Therapy Around the Globe series is created with an intention to foster global communication in the occupational therapy world. Each episode will feature a guest or delegate representing their country. The discussions are purposefully driven to understand occupational therapy from the country's perspective, specifically surround the topics of history of occupational therapy, the awareness levels in the country, what does OT education entail, the licensure, a scope of practice, the current situation of the profession in the country, and future of occupational therapy. Hello, Yara, and welcome in Zoom Nourish by Your podcast.
Hi.
So that is the only German I know. So let's talk in English for the rest of it.
You know what's really funny? I'm so used to using both languages that I didn't even notice that you switched.
Oh, for the language, wow.
Yeah.
Yara, it's really good to connect with you, and thank you for taking out the time to share about Austria and everything related to occupational therapy in Austria with us today.
Yeah, thank you so much for the invitation.
Sure. So let's start with what does occupational therapy mean to you? As an OT, you have been practicing for quite a few years now. So what does it mean to you?
Occupational therapy means to me that you can really look at the individual and what's meaningful to them. And I think that's one of the benefits our profession really brings with it, that you have the chance to learn so much from your clients. And with individual, it's not just the person, but also if it's a group of people or a community, you can look at them individually and see what's important to them and learn from them before helping them to accomplish their goals. And I think that's very unique about our profession.
Yeah, it being client-centered and having that social component as well. So definitely, so it does sound like you enjoy the social aspect of it, and building that bond with your clients while you're doing occupational therapy. Since the episode is about Austria, let's discuss some of the current situation in Austria regarding occupational therapy. So, in terms of what is the scope of practice or what areas the professionals work in right now?
So in Austria, we have 4,600 occupational therapists that are practicing, and the population of Austria is around 9 million people. Mainly occupational therapists in Austria have two options. You can either be employed in hospital or rehabilitation center, so mainly in a clinical setting, but some occupational therapists are also employed outside the clinical setting, but that's not very often. Or occupational therapists can be self-employed and work in their own practice. So these are like the two main options occupational therapists in Austria have.
Oh, sure. Okay. So it's mostly in, you said in clinic-based settings. So is there like an acute care and a post-operative care and long-term rehab as well in the
Yes.
clinic-based?
Yeah, we have the acute phase and different rehabilitation phases as well. So occupational therapists are working in these fields. And there are also some that are working in non-clinical fields, but those fields are more emerging and becoming more popular. But it's not always easy to work outside the clinical setting. So in Austria, there are also occupational therapists working outside the clinical setting. But for these areas, it's not so easy to find positions where you can work as an employee, because in Austria, different ministries are responsible for different areas. And for example, in school-based occupational therapy, the educational ministry would be responsible for the payment rather than the health ministry. But being a healthcare profession, the political side only sees us within the health ministry and not working in the other areas. So that's a bit of a problem from the political side, why it's difficult for occupational therapists to leave the clinical area.
Sure. So you said the funding comes from different sectors from the government, right? So are these hospitals government-based entities, or are they like private hospitals and OTs get employed and still the funding comes through the government?
There are also private hospitals, but I do believe that the majority of occupational therapists that are employed are working in governmentally funded rehabilitation centers and hospitals. And and also there's one main health insurance company in Austria, that's the state health insurance. And there are some self-employed occupational therapists as well who have contracts with the health insurance. So it is possible for people in Austria to get occupational therapy for free. Like the clients can visit an occupational therapist and the health insurance is paying for it.
Yes.
But there are not so many occupational therapists who have a contract with the health insurance company. So they often have long waiting lists, especially in pediatrics, or if you need occupational therapy quite urgent, like after hand surgery, it can be difficult to get an appointment with an occupational therapist that has a contract with the health insurance company.
Oh, okay. So makes sense. That is why there are more of these government-run entities, and they OTs prefer to work there instead of having their private practice.
And when they have their private practice, they can also be a private therapist. And then the clients have to pay the occupational therapists, and then they send their invoice to the health insurance company, and they get some money of it back.
Oh, okay, as a reimbursement.
Whereas when the therapist has a contract with the health insurance company, then the client doesn't have to pay. It works through the connection between the therapist and the health insurance.
Got it. Yeah. Makes sense. So, since we are discussing about these different areas of practice, what is the scope of practice for OT practitioners in Austria? Which different areas? Yeah, I think you did touch upon a little bit on that of having them work in the hospital setting or acute care or post-rehab setting. What different? I think you mentioned pediatrics as well and school-based. So, what are the different areas or scope of practice currently in Austria?
Mainly, the areas are divided in pediatrics, geriatrics, orthopedics, neurologic, mental health, and psychiatry, and rheumatology is there as well, hand therapy, forensics. So it's really quite broad, the areas where occupational therapists work at. And being the WFOT delegate, I know that within the international point of view on occupational therapists, it's not so much divided into these practice areas anymore. But in practice in Austria, it still is. And also because we have for the education of health professionals and especially occupational therapists, we have a law in Austria that regulates the education. And in there, it's stated that you have to have done internships in these different areas. And it tells how many different internships you have to have had once you graduate. It's like from the beginning, when you study occupational therapy, you have these different areas in your mind because you have to do internships in many different aspects and fields of practice with clients of different age groups.
Oh, sure. Okay. So this regulating body is governed by the government?
Yes, education is like overlooked by the government, like the law behind it. Yeah.
Sure. And I was quite intrigued when you mentioned occupational therapy in forensic science, because I was very interested in, I was almost getting into forensic science and then I switched to OT. So, do you have any idea on what do OTs do in that area?
They work in prisons and help the people there to still engage in meaningful activities and to. So for one aspect of it is still when they are in prison to help them to engage in meaningful activities, and on the other hand to prepare them for activities and occupations that are awaiting them and they have to get used to again.
Oh, okay. Sounds good. And also, I'm assuming there might be an aspect of mental health as well
Yes,
there.
yes.
So, how did your journey start with occupational therapy?
It started when I was about 14. Back then, Google started to be a thing, and our teacher at school asked us to get used to Google and use a search engine. And to make sure that we are actually using a search engine to answer a question, he asked us the question, what is occupational therapy? So I Googled it when I was 14 and I found out about it. And then around 2 years later, I asked this teacher, so how did you come up with occupational therapy? Why did you ask this question? And he told me that his wife is an occupational therapist. So I met with her and learned more about it. And then I applied at the university when I was 18, because in Austria, you finish school when you're 18, and then you can go to university and study. And that's what I did. And I got a spot at 2 different universities of applied science. So I chose the one in the town where I was already living, which was easier for me. And when I graduated, I was 21.
Oh, wow. Okay. So, like in terms of the education, since we are around that topic, what is the basic minimum requirement for education for an OT to work as a professional in occupational therapy in Austria? And also about what are the different course structures available or students have access to?
So in Austria, you have to have at least a bachelor's degree to be allowed to practice. But if you want to teach occupational therapy in a bachelor's program, if you want to become an educator, then you have to have a master's degree, because you have to have at least a degree that's one level higher than the students are going to get once they graduate. But I think that's the case in many other countries as well. But to practice as an occupational therapist, you need the bachelor's degree. And that also stated in the law behind the education. So it's the same for physiotherapists, for speech and language therapists, for many other health professions as well.
Sure. So, how many schools approximately would you say are there in Austria right now for the bachelor's or and master's, or do you also have doctorate or PhD programs as well?
So we have, like, in almost every district in Austria, we have a bachelor's program for occupational therapists. So there are, I think, 8 schools at the moment, and they are all WFOT acknowledged. And master's programs, we don't have that many in Austria, and not all of them are specifically occupational science masters. It's also possible to do a master's in a different field. Like I, for example, did my master's degree in health assisting engineering. And that meant it was a master that was for health professionals as well as technicians. And we learned to work in project together, especially when it comes to assistive technology and assistive aids. You need both. You need the technicians and you need the health professionals to interact with each other to come up with technologies that can actually be used by the clients and that are needed. And so that's a master's degree that I did. But they are very different, and they are also different in the ECTS points you get when you do the master's degree. So you have to, when you choose one, you have to be aware of how many ECTS points you get, if you are then eligible for a PhD after that as well or not.
Ah,
And then with the PhD options in Austria, it's mainly around that you have to find someone who's supporting your thesis and who does that. So I'm missing the right word in English for that one. Like the person who does the thesis with you and guides you and supports you, mentors you.
Yeah, your mentor or your coach.
Yes. And there are not so many occupational therapists who could do that because there are not so many PhD options in Austria. And sometimes it's hard to find a mentor that would take on an occupational therapist without them being an occupational therapist.
Ah, okay. Yeah, makes sense. So it's very interesting actually to know this about Austria. And you mentioned some ETCH score?
Yes, I'm not sure what the right abbreviation in English would be. It's like the amount of hours you have in your degree. Like, for example, I don't know the exact numbers by heart, I'm sorry, but let's say for a bachelor's degree, you have to have at least 180 of these points to be allowed to do a master's degree. So for the master's degree, the entry condition would be that you have done a bachelor's degree that has that amount
hours of requirement.
of hours. Yeah.
Oh, got it. And does that include the theory or the courses or also like your field work?
Yes, that includes everything.
Everything. Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, that's a similar pattern, I think, in India as well. A little bit of a similar pattern I can see around that area. So, what is the most interesting thing about occupational therapy for you, or something really striking for you, or along through your journey? If something has, some incident that had happened with you, which was like very memorable for your life.
For me, it was when I was studying, I heard so many names of occupational therapists who invented models and who did great work and who like role models in occupational therapy. And I always was really interested in the international world. And when we had this class about international occupational therapy, and I met the WFOT delegate at that time, I, after that class, sent her an email and asked her, so what do I have to do to become you one day? And she replied to me and she said, well, get engaged in the National Association first, then maybe become a board member later. And then she told me more steps to do to become the WFOT delegate. So in my mind, it was like, okay, I'm going to be that in my 40s or so. And then I became the WFOT delegate when I was 27 because I just followed what she told me.
Yeah.
And so I think the OT world is not that big. We are not so many in the world. So if there is an OT who's eager to get involved more and do things, just contact the person that you kind of want to be and ask them what to do. And yeah, there are ways that you can reach them. And then when I was at the first international conference and one of the OTs told me, oh, you look over at that table, you see, I can't remember all the people I met there, but it was like, you see, this is this person, they wrote this paper. And I was like, oh my gosh, they are actually here. So for me, it was like meeting like really famous people. Like for other people it would be sitting in a room with maybe movie stars or musicians, and for me it was like sitting in this room with all these famous OTs was really exciting.
Yeah, and so now that we're talking about WFOT, so what does your role entail, or what do you do? What does your work with WFOT look like?
As a WFOT delegate for Austria, I'm like the communication spot between the WFOT and the National Association. So I report in both ways. And I attend the council meetings and the congresses that WFOT has. So every 2 years, I'm meeting the other delegates. And when we meet, during the council meetings, we usually discuss topics and issues we have in the countries and then form little groups. And we now also have an online forum that we can use to discuss topics with the other delegates. And that way we can then report the international information back to our national association and include it in current things we are working on. And like at the moment, we are trying to path the way for future occupational therapy in Austria and are discussing with the doctors at the moment a lot, because we would really like to work more independently and have a broader spectrum of things that we can include in our work, because the official scope of practice in Austria, like the definition of occupational therapy that describes what you are allowed to do as an OT and what you should do as an OT, that doesn't really reflect anymore what occupational therapy has become, because that's already around 30 years old, that definition. Yeah. And now occupational therapy is way broader, way more occupation focused than it was in the definition back then. But the doctors would rather have us like a level below them so that they can tell us what to do and not working as equal partners. Yeah. And the WFOT has a position paper on the autonomy of occupational therapy. And these position papers really help us to underline our thoughts and our visions with international perspectives. And so my role as WFOT delegate is also to have these position papers in mind and all this international information in mind when we are trying to develop things in Austria, so that we can use these things to underline our position.
Oh, a lot on your table.
But I'm really enjoying that. I like to know what's happening around me and what's happening in the occupational therapy world. I find it really interesting.
Yeah, and you get the chance to lead the change in the country, so that's, yes. I think that's a very very good thing that you're doing. So in terms of making changes, and you spoke a little bit about the future of OT and where you would like to head. I mean, OTs would like to head more towards having independent practices. So is that do you see a wave of entrepreneurship emerging in occupational therapy in Austria, and also new areas emerging of new areas of practice as such emerging in Austria?
I think one aspect that really brought many of my colleagues to changing their practice was the pandemic, as in other countries, I believe, as well. So many started using tele-rehabilitation as an option, or developing other they can do online as well, to have like a broader spectrum of things they are offering for the clients. So that is one thing that changed. Also in the association, we are looking in developing a quality certificate for occupational therapists and their practices, so that they have more incentives to really enhance their quality management in the practice, and to look at how they are doing things in the practice. And then with other fields, that's also happening in Austria. But I think we really need the change on the political side and the law perspective as well, so that we can really go out there and do that as occupational therapists. Because what's happening often is that someone is offering a position, but it's not called occupational therapy. But when you read the job description, you think, oh, that's exactly what occupational therapists do and can do and should do. So occupational therapists can obviously apply for that position, but then they would not be employed as an occupational therapist, but as a project manager or something like that.
Oh, interesting. Okay. So is that one of your advocacy effort to change these or broaden that aspect and get it on paper for the definitions of occupational therapy?
Yes, that's definitely something the association is working on. And it takes a long time. And also the partner you have on political side, they are changing, because when there are new elections, you have a different person sitting there. You have the feeling sometimes you have to start from the beginning again.
Yeah.
And so sometimes things happen fast and you don't expect them, and then things get slowed down again. But that's definitely something the association has been working on and is still working on.
Yeah. I've been there, felt that, where you have to like start from ground zero again. You're almost through the last point and then you got to again go through the whole loop. But persistence, hard work, and, aspirational OTs like us bring a change. So kudos to you on that.
Well, and to my colleagues on the OT board in Austria.
Yes, definitely. So Yara, now let's talk about how and when did occupational therapy start in Austria. Let's go back a little bit into the history.
So the history of occupational therapy goes back more than 50 years in Austria, and it hasn't always been called ergotherapy. So the German word for occupational therapy is ergotherapie, which goes back to the Greek word ergin, which means to do something. So that's the meaning of it. Before that, it's really hard to translate that back to English, but it was more around to be occupied. The term of occupational therapy. So it was more around work and labor and to be occupied, but not about the really meaningful occupations. And it started mainly after the war, when people were in, now I'm missing the English word again, where the soldiers were
Post-traumatic rehab?
Yeah.
Post-traumatic
And
rehabilitation or something.
yes, that's where they started to engage them into occupations to improve their health. So it was always around using occupations to improve health, but in the beginnings, when occupational therapy started in Austria, it was not meaningful occupations. It was just about being occupied. And that's why sometimes when using that old word for occupational therapy in German, then it sounds more like, oh, these are the ones that are just doing something with the people to keep them busy, to keep them occupied. Yeah. But it's not, it doesn't sound so goal related. And so with the newer phrase ergotherapie, it's more clear what it is about. But we are often struggling with the word occupation when we want to translate things, because it's really different to find a German word that actually describes what occupation means.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Got it. Right now, like the governing bodies, do they work on all these aspects as well about like let's change the face of occupational therapy and what people perceive about it in Austria? So, and also like what are the governing bodies, or do you have an association, right, for occupational therapy in Austria?
Yes.
And what other governing bodies are there who would regulate occupational therapy in your country?
There was quite a big change 5 years ago. Maybe when looking from an outside perspective, I don't know how many people internationally know where Austria is, but for them that know that it's in the middle of Europe, they would maybe think, oh, they have had registration and regulation and all of that for a long time. But actually, up until 5 years ago, it was like that once you graduated your bachelor's degree, you got your license to practice, and it was indefinite. So you received your license after graduating and you were just able to start to work as an occupational therapist. And there was no registration, no CPD requirements, none of that. And only 5 years ago, finally, the register had started for all health professionals. And the associations thought about becoming the register authority, who is the regulatory body as well, but it would just have been like a really, really massive workload, which was not easy to calculate how much staff it would need, how it would actually work, like how many costs it would be. And also the political side didn't really want the associations to do it, because it's also around who owns the data behind it, and who's the one who has to ask the other one to get the data. It's not that the data is hidden, like you can see the register online, but still when you own it, you have different ways to use it in statistics and these things. And so the associations would have liked to own the data, but the political governments as well. Then it was still an aspect of who can be that, who can actually be the regulatory body from political side. And at the moment, we actually have two regulatory bodies who are both governmental organizations, but one is more for the ones who are employed, and the other one is for the ones that are self-employed. So depending on where you work the most, because around 1,000 OTs in Austria are both. They are employed, but they also work self-employed in their own practice a few hours, or the other way around. They are mainly in the practice, but are employed as well. And they can choose where they want to register. Like the register itself is one thing, but the authority who looks at your documents, you can choose which one you want to go to. But if you are only self-employed or only employed, then you go to one or the other.
And then if you work in both, you just choose or pick one to enroll. You don't have to register with both.
No, you just choose one.
Okay.
Because the register is the same. It's just about who does the work, who puts you on that register.
Got it. Okay.
But it's the same register.
Right.
It's just about dividing the workload and yeah, managing it and the funding aspect of it as well. Okay. Yeah. So and then for re-registration at the moment, because you have to re-register every 5 years. Okay. And at the moment, there are no requirements connected to the re-registration. So all you have to do is to update your details, and then you are re-registered for the next 5 years. Okay. But there's also a law in Austria that you have to fulfill the CPD requirements, that you have to have a certain amount of courses, that course hours that you did in 5 years. Okay. Yeah, but it's not only course hours, you can also do other things. Like when you write a thesis or a journal article, you get CPD points as well that count towards it. But you have to have a certain amount in 5 years. But that's not connected to the re-registration. That's only when you are self-employed. If someone asks you, you have to be able to show it, and it could be a problem with insurance when you are insured as self-employed OT and you don't have your CPD requirements and no insurance cover you, and also it could happen that your clients don't get reimbursed from the health insurance company when they find out that you haven't, then you would be allowed to practice. But it's not that it's actively checked. It's more that you have to have it ready if someone checks you one day. And when you are an employed occupational therapist, then it's often checked by the employer, who wants to make sure that the occupational therapists fulfill their CPD requirements, but it's not connected to the registration at the moment.
Oh, okay. So then if anybody doesn't want to check into the requirements, it's fine, and they would OTs would still be able to work with the registration.
Yes, like officially not, but at the moment there is a law that says you have to have the CPD requirements.
Okay, got it.
But the process for doing like the executive part of the law hasn't been defined yet.
Okay.
So no one is responsible to check on the self-employed OTs.
Got it. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, we discussed about how things have changed for occupational therapists as such, but how about the awareness levels in general public? Like, what do you feel about the awareness levels of when you started to now, and how it has changed in terms of the general public knowing about occupational therapy and reaching out for therapy and services?
I think especially in the field of pediatrics, the awareness level is quite bigger than it was a few years back. So now it's more in the media when when kids had occupational therapy, it's the parents talking about it, it's the kindergarten mentioning it to the parents. So often when you hear about occupational therapy, it's related to pediatrics. And also, I think in neurologic and orthopedic rehabilitation, and then also in geriatrics, especially with diagnosis with dementia and these diagnoses, then people have heard about occupational therapy and know what it is. But I think especially with the population that don't have kids yet, it's not so well known. And also maybe in the population that have older kids where occupational therapy wasn't that popular yet. So more people know the word, what it means, but not so much, I think, know what occupational therapists actually do.
Oh, okay, got it. Yeah. Uh, in terms of the awareness levels, or that the meaning of occupational therapy for general public, what steps can be taken to further the OT profession in Austria?
We release a press statement every month. So every month for the Occupational Therapy Association chooses a topic often related to a special day in that month. As you know, like there's almost every day in the year is an awareness day for something special. So we choose one of these days per month and write a press release around this topic and to become more visible in press and media. And we choose a different day every year for the month. So it's not always on the same day that we are writing these articles. And we also encourage our members to promote occupational therapy. And for example, we have PowerPoint presentations ready with online courses connected to them. So our members can, for example, go and do in their town and in their village presentation about occupational therapy and preventing back pain or something like that. And then we have the PowerPoint presentation ready for them and instructions what to do. And because we found that many of them would like to promote occupational therapy, but they then don't know where to start, how to start, and which topic to choose and how to do it. And so we have a list of PowerPoint presentations and courses that our members can use when they want to do a presentation in their community.
Oh, interesting. This takes me back to down my memory lane when I started. At that time, I started in India, so the awareness levels were not as much in general public. I would say, and that's what I used to do. I used to go to the outskirts. In city, it was still better, right? So I used to go in on the outskirts or in the rural areas and do all these presentations to make the general public aware of there are these therapies available and this is what you can do, because most often I think it's they do want help but they don't know what's wrong, or what's going on with my child, how I can help my child. I used to work in pediatrics, so I'm just addressing it on from that perspective. But yeah, it does take me down the memory lane of going out there and presenting everywhere, increasing that awareness and spreading out that information. So, where do you think the OT curve is heading to in Austria in a few years? What can we expect? Or what do you anticipate?
It really has a lot to do what's happening in the next couple of months with the doctors, how we can work together with them or not, and what's going to happen, because we are really about to change the definition of occupational therapy as it's stated in the law. So that's really a goal of the association at the moment. And the process has started and stakeholders are involved. But the problem is, once you start changing something and you have the stakeholders involved, the politics involved, it can go both ways. So it can get better for us. So we are looking into things like direct access, more areas where we can work, more things we can include to really make sure that we can do meaningful activities with our clients. And then on the other hand, having the doctors who really want it to stay like it, that we can only work with clients when they write a referral for occupational therapy. So that's how it is at the moment. A doctor has to prescribe occupational therapy, and then we are allowed to practice. We are not allowed to practice unless it's health prevention. When it's health prevention, then we are allowed to practice without a referral from a doctor. So that's really a big topic for the association at the moment, to get the discussions going and hopefully towards our vision, what we would like to achieve. And another aspect in Austria, which is really an interest of the politics at the moment, is the area of primary healthcare. And there are many projects and a lot of money behind it from political side in primary healthcare projects. But the definition of primary healthcare is not so well known within the health professions in Austria, because it's different to the healthcare system that we are used to. So it's not that easy to implement primary healthcare in the healthcare system as it is in the moment. So within the healthcare professionals, but also within the profession, the idea behind primary healthcare and the definition is not so clear. And so it's not that easy to involve occupational therapy in it as much as we would like to.
Sure. So there are some significant advocacy efforts in Austria going on right now, and hopefully you see the success soon on that front. So good luck to
Yes.
you on your advocacy efforts.
Thank you.
So we are now approaching towards our game segment. So I have this game that I play with every delegate or representative towards the end of my episode. So it's called the 5-second rule segment. So I'll just explain you really quickly. So you will be asked about 5 questions, and you got to answer each question in 5 seconds.
I really do hope I can. When I read that, I was like, oh my gosh, what is it gonna be? Hopefully I will be able to answer them.
Yeah, so the questions are more like about your country. So things like, oh, what would be something you would recommend somebody to eat in your country, things like that. So I think more about the country as such and not on the OT technical aspects. So
All right.
go well, I think. Are you ready? I'm gonna start when you're ready.
I'm ready.
Okay, I'm gonna start the timer, and then we'll have a buzzer for every 5 seconds. All right. So I'll
All right.
buzzer once I ask you the first question. So your first question is, name one interesting facts Austria is known for.
People in Austria like to wear dirndls for special occasions.
Can you repeat that? What was the word?
Dirndl?
Okay.
People in Austria especially women, like to wear dirndl for special occasions. And I did this as well for the first council meetings that I attended at the WFOT. It's like a special dress, a traditional costume.
Oh, okay.
And it's on the last day of the council meeting. every delegate wears something that's typical for their country to represent the country. So I've always been wearing dildos, just not at the last one because I was pregnant and I couldn't fit in my traditional dresses anymore because they are really tight around the waist. And it was really funny at my first, I think it was the council meeting. It was in Colombia, and for the first time, I met Jenny Stoffel. You probably know her, the former president of the AOTA. Mm-hmm. And on the last day of the council meeting, she asked me if she could put on one of my dresses as well, because I had different ones with me. And then we danced the waltz together on the last day of the council meeting. And I have this picture with her. And it's like one of my the famous moments from the council meeting when I got to meet like a famous occupational therapist, and then she was wearing my dress and dancing with me. So I felt very proud of my accomplishments during that time. That was 2016 in Colombia.
Oh, wow, a long time.
Yeah. And every year this memory comes up on Facebook. We share it with each other, Jenny Stoffel and I, and comment again on it because we really enjoyed that.
Yeah, how amazing. Embracing cultures.
Yes.
So your next question, 3 things to know when traveling to Austria. Like when somebody is traveling to Austria, what would be the 3 things to know? Like maybe the weather, or something that we have to be mindful about.
Yeah. So one thing is like when you study German and you think you know German, you probably won't understand anyone in Austria because they have a really special dialect, especially the more you go into the west or the more rural the area is you are visiting. It could be still hard to understand the people when they are talking to you because the dialect is often quite strong. In the cities, not so much. It will be easier in the cities. Mm-hmm. And if you still like the first aspect, the language, when you come to Austria to improve your German, it can be also tricky because most of the people speak English. So I used to live with someone from Ireland and in a shared flat in Vienna, and he lived in Austria for 5 years, not speaking a word of German because everyone would speak English with him. So he didn't even have the chance to improve his German because everyone would just speak English with him. And the second thing is a friend of mine found really funny when she visited me. I lived in New Zealand for a year, and my friend from New Zealand came to visit me during wintertime, and she was like, "Oh, that's so weird. You have inside and outside clothing." And I asked her, "What do you mean with inside and outside clothing?" And she was like, "Well, in New Zealand, the temperature is always the same. It doesn't matter if you are outside the house or inside the house. So you don't really change your outfit, and you also don't necessarily take off your shoes when you go into the house. But in Austria, you would wear like many layers in winter when it's cold, and then it's warm inside the houses. So you take everything off. And so you don't need that many layers inside the house, and people also usually take off their shoes when they enter the house and then put on slippers or just wear socks in the house.
Oh, interesting.
And then you ask about a third aspect, and I think the third aspect is that sometimes people, especially in Vienna, can seem to be a bit rude, but they are actually not that bad. It's just they have this grumpiness sometimes. That's what Vienna is known for. But so people shouldn't take it personally if someone seems grumpy or upset. It's just how they sometimes are.
Oh, okay. Good to know. Yeah, so you're giving really good answers and, something really interesting about Austria. But the only thing we got to answer before the buzzer ends. So you got to start your answer before the 5 seconds are over. Make sense?
Oh, yeah. Sorry, I wasn't sure about this.
Waiting for the buzzer. So.
Yeah.
All right, let's see. The next one, 3 bucket list items in Austria. Must visit bucket list items in Austria.
So I would say Vienna, the old town, especially, like there are many buildings that people should have seen, but then also a place in the mountains, because the mountains are really nice, so more towards Salzburg or Innsbruck. So these are like the main cities that I would suggest to visit. So and what else? There are also nice rivers and lakes in Austria. So I personally like to spend holiday times in Austria. But it really depends what people would like to do, if they are more interested in history or more in outdoor and nature. So if people want to do outdoor and nature stuff, the west of Austria is more interesting. When it's history, then the old towns in the cities. And when it's more about drinking wine and vineyards, then the east part of the country is more interesting. But I think as the country is so small, and especially if people would visit Austria from America, they would probably do the whole country and visit everywhere within 4 days or so.
Okay.
So yeah,
Yeah,
different, many different things that you could do.
so you what would you recommend? Like about a 4 to 5 day holiday is good for Austria, to explore Austria as such.
Well, if I go on a vacation in Austria, I like to spend 4 days in the same place to explore everything that is in that one place. But I think if you are ambitious, you could do Austria in a week. Let's say a week.
Okay. So let's go to your next question. 2 must eat authentic food items in Austria.
One is definitely schnitzel, I would say. Do you know what schnitzel is, or should I explain it?
Yes, please explain it. So I know the word, but I don't know exactly what it means.
Yeah,
I mean,
so
in an
it's
authentic way.
really thin, flat meat, and you put it in egg and flour, and then you fry it. So that's
Is it's a savory item?
yes. So it's egg, flour, and like breadcrumbs, and then it's fried. So that's like one really traditional thing in Austria. And the second thing I would suggest, like really depending on the area, because every area in Austria has their specialties. And so it depends where you are there, but I know the 5 seconds have been over a long time.
Why?
But I think a second thing I'm not sure if that's so traditional for Austria, but I haven't seen it anywhere else, is Leberknödel suppe. It's like a soup with a dumpling with liver. And even if you don't like liver, it's really good. Yeah, so that would be the second thing, I guess, that's a bit like different to what you eat in other places. And I also really like the bread in Austria. Compared to other countries. Bread in Austria is really good. It's not really typically Austrian, but it's just really good in Austria.
Okay, I have to try it when I visit Austria. So let's start your last question. Oh, sorry. So 2 things you love about Austrian culture.
That's a really difficult one. I think to answer this question really good, I might be not aware enough of what's like typically for Austrian culture. So
Like how you mentioned the dress or the attire, which is like so authentic to Austria, um, or very cultural as such. So something related to those aspects, like I mean something.
Yeah, I think most of the things are so normal for me that I don't appreciate them enough, I think. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah. Like you have been living in the culture for so long.
Yeah, and so I'm like thinking, okay, what are the really cultural aspects that I really appreciate in Austria? It's that's a really tough one.
Or how about some cultural aspects that are unique to Austria? Like you haven't seen, like the attire is very unique. Like you wouldn't have seen it somewhere else.
Yeah, it's like um again, when I lived in Vienna, I think I didn't notice so many cultural things because, but I think it's the same in most big cities. But when thinking about the small village in the western part of Austria, close to Innsbruck, where my husband is from, when we visit his family, there are many traditions and many things I really like. Like there's a music group in the village, and they play a Christmas concert every year in December, and I really like everything that's happening around that aspect. And yeah, the Christmas time is really special, and they have like very old nativities in that village.
Oh, okay.
Do you know like nativity sceneries with Jesus and Maria and the baby, and the small figures they use, they are like more than hundreds years old and have been passed on from family to family. And in December, you can walk through the village and go to different houses and see the nativities in the houses. And they are not just small ones, they would be like 2 meters wide and so like really big sceneries with everything that's happening in the nativity, and the figures get put in as it happens. So the baby
It's like
Jesus
a
would
live
only
show.
be, yeah, in the
Oh,
well, on the day. So only on the 24th of December, baby Jesus would be in there, and then only on the 6th of January the kings arrive in the
oh,
scenery.
got it.
So
Okay.
yeah,
Wow. Interesting.
so those are things I really like. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, Yara, it's been a pleasure to have you on our show. You shared about the current phase of what's going on in Austria and the steps that you and your colleagues have been taking to bring occupational therapy to the forefront and really advocate for it as an independent profession, expanding your scope of practice and aligning in terms of equity, right? Making it an equitable profession as such in Austria. So, thank you so much for coming on our show and sharing all about occupational therapy in Austria.
Yeah, thank you so much for this opportunity. And I'm really looking forward to listen to the other episodes as well to learn more about occupational therapy around the world.
Yeah, it's going to be amazing. Like there's so many countries, right? And then it's interesting to know because like I have been working. I just released an episode with India, and then now it's with Austria. And when I think about when I listen to the stories, when I listen to what's actually happening, it's there are some similarities, there are some differences. So it's really intriguing to look into these patterns of occupational therapy and how to take those steps at a in a united global manner. So I think it's a really good information for me to learn as such.
Yes, definitely.
Well, thank you.
Thanks.